What happens when a struggling single father's split-second decision to save a drowning stranger changes both their lives forever? Tonight, I'm sharing the incredible true story of Daniel Carter and Elena Chen, a tale of courage, love, and destiny that began with a car crash and ended with an empire transformed. Stay with me until the very end, and don't forget to comment your city below so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The windshield wipers of Daniel Carter's beat-up Honda Civic fought a losing battle against the torrential rain as he navigated the winding road toward Pleasant Valley Bridge. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday in October, and the storm had been building for hours, turning what should have been a simple grocery run into a white-knuckle drive through sheets of water that seemed to fall sideways in the howling wind. Daniel's calloused hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he thought about the empty refrigerator waiting at home and the two little girls who would wake up hungry in just a few hours. Emma, 7 years old, with pigtails that never stayed straight, and Sophie, barely 5, with gap-toothed grins that could light up the darkest room. They were his entire world had been ever since their mother walked out 3 years ago, leaving nothing but a note on the kitchen counter and the lingering scent of her perfume. "Daddy works too much," she had written in her careful script. "I can't do this anymore. They're better off without me." Better off. The words still stung like a slap across the face every time he remembered them. How could anyone be better off without their mother? But Daniel had learned to push those thoughts away, to focus on what mattered, keeping his daughters fed, clothed, and loved. Even if it meant working double shifts at the construction site, even if it meant grocery shopping at midnight, because it was the only time the store had marked down prices on the expired items he could actually afford. The plastic bags in his back seat rustled with every turn. Generic cereal, day-old bread, a small container of milk that would have to last until Friday's paycheck. It wasn't much, but it would get them through another few days. It always did, somehow. Lightning split the sky ahead, illuminating the bridge that stretched across the Clearwater River like a steel spine against the storm. The bridge was old, built in the 1960s, when the town had dreams of becoming something bigger than it was. Now it mostly served as a reminder of promises broken and potential unfulfilled, much like Daniel himself. He was thinking about Emma's upcoming school project, something about family trees that made his chest tight with worry about how to explain the missing branches, when he saw the headlights. They appeared suddenly in his rearview mirror, weaving erratically across the rain-slicked asphalt. The car was moving too fast for the conditions, much too fast, and Daniel felt his stomach drop as he realized the driver was going to lose control. "Come on," he muttered, easing his own vehicle toward the shoulder. "Slow down, you idiot." But the black Mercedes behind him didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed to accelerate, hydroplaning across the bridge's surface like a bullet skipping across water. Daniel watched in horror as the luxury sedan fishtailed once, twice, then spun completely around before slamming sideways into the bridge's concrete barrier. The impact was tremendous, a sound like thunder and breaking glass that cut through even the storm's fury. Sparks flew as metal scraped against stone, and then, in a moment that would replay in Daniel's nightmares for years to come, the barrier gave way. The Mercedes flipped over the edge of the bridge and disappeared into the churning darkness below. For a heartbeat, Daniel sat frozen behind the wheel of his Honda, rain hammering against his windshield, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Then training kicked in, not from any formal rescue course, but from 28 years of being the kind of man who ran toward trouble instead of away from it. He slammed on his brakes and pulled over, hazard lights flashing as he grabbed his cell phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency? There's been an accident on Pleasant Valley Bridge. Daniel shouted over the storm. A car went over the side into the river. I need police, fire department, ambulance, everything you've got. Sir, are you injured? Are you in a safe location? I'm fine, but someone's in the water down there. I'm going after them. Sir, please do not attempt a rescue. Emergency personnel are en route. Daniel ended the call and shoved the phone into his pocket. Emergency personnel were at least 15 minutes away, maybe more in this weather. Whoever was in that car didn't have 15 minutes. He burst out of his Honda into the howling storm, immediately soaked to the skin by rain that felt like ice water. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he stumbled to the broken section of barrier and peered over the edge. The Clearwater River was living up to its name in reverse tonight. The water was black as oil and moving fast, swollen by hours of rainfall. Somewhere in that churning chaos was a car, and inside that car was a human being who was probably unconscious and definitely drowning. Daniel didn't hesitate. He kicked off his work boots and shrugged out of his heavy jacket, then climbed over what remained of the barrier. The drop was maybe 30 feet, not enough to kill him, but certainly enough to break bones if he hit wrong. Below, he could just make out the dark shape of the Mercedes, already half submerged and sinking fast. Emma Sophie, he whispered, thinking of his daughters sleeping safely in their beds. Daddy's got to help someone. And then he jumped. The impact with the water drove the breath from his lungs in an explosive gasp. The river was even colder than he had expected, so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 icy needles. The current immediately grabbed him, trying to drag him downstream, but Daniel was strong from years of construction work. He fought against the flow, swimming hard toward the sinking car. By the time he reached the Mercedes, only the roof and part of the rear window were still above water. Daniel took a deep breath and dove his hands, feeling along the car's surface until he found a door handle. Locked. He tried the other doors. All locked. The driver was still inside, trapped, and in another minute or two the car would be completely submerged. Daniel surfaced, gasping, then dove again. This time he felt around until he found a loose piece of debris from the crash, a chunk of concrete from the barrier. It was heavy, awkward to maneuver underwater, but it would have to do. He smashed it against the driver's side window with all his strength. The safety glass spiderwebbed, but held. Again. Again. On the fourth try, the window finally gave way, and Daniel felt the current suck him partway into the car as water rushed in. The driver was a woman, unconscious, her seatbelt still fastened. Daniel's lungs were burning, screaming for air, but he forced himself to stay calm as he worked to free her. The seatbelt was jammed, probably from the impact. He braced his feet against the car's frame and pulled with everything he had. The belt snapped. Daniel grabbed the woman around the waist and kicked hard toward the surface, his vision starting to tunnel from lack of oxygen. They broke through just as his strength was giving out, both of them gasping and choking on river water. The woman was conscious now, coughing up water and struggling weakly in his arms. "It's okay," Daniel shouted over the storm. "I've got you. Just try to stay calm." But staying calm was easier said than done. The current was strong, and Daniel was already exhausted from the rescue. The shore seemed impossibly far away, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each stroke. The woman. He could see now that she was Asian, probably in her 30s, wearing what had once been an expensive business suit, was trying to help, but she was clearly a poor swimmer and kept panicking every time a wave washed over their heads. "Listen to me," Daniel said, treading water as he repositioned his grip on her. "My name is Daniel. I'm going to get you to shore, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She nodded, her dark eyes wide with fear, but focusing on his face. "Elena," she gasped. "My name is Elena." "Nice to meet you, Elena. Now hold on tight and let me do the work." What followed was the longest swim of Daniel's life. Fighting against the current, supporting Elena's weight, his muscles screaming with exhaustion, and his lungs burning from the cold air. More than once he thought they weren't going to make it, that the river would claim them both. But every time his strength faltered, he thought about Emma and Sophie waking up to find their father gone, and somehow he found the will to keep going. 20 minutes after jumping from the bridge, Daniel's feet finally touched the muddy bottom of the riverbank. He half-carried, half-dragged Elena out of the water and onto the shore, both of them collapsing in the mud and grass, gasping like landed fish. "Are you hurt?" Daniel asked when he could finally speak. "Anything broken?" Elena shook her head, then immediately winced and touched her forehead. "I think I hit my head when the car flipped. Everything's a little fuzzy. You probably have a concussion. We need to get you to a hospital." In the distance, Daniel could hear sirens approaching. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. The cavalry was finally arriving, though 20 minutes too late to do any good. He helped Elena sit up, noticing for the first time that despite being half-drowned and covered in river mud, she carried herself with a certain dignity, a poise that spoke of money and education and a life very different from his own. "You saved my life," she said, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You jumped off a bridge in the middle of a storm to save a complete stranger." Daniel shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with her intense gaze. Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," Elena said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most people would have called 911 and waited for someone else to handle it." "Yeah, well." Daniel pushed himself to his feet and offered her a hand up. "I've got kids. I know what it's like to need help and not have it come fast enough." The first responders found them there on the riverbank, a construction worker in soaked clothes and a businesswoman in a ruined designer suit, both looking like survivors of a shipwreck. The paramedics immediately took charge, checking Elena for signs of serious injury, while the police peppered Daniel with questions about what he had witnessed. "The car was hydroplaning," he explained for the third time to a young officer with a mustache who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Lost control, hit this barrier, went over. I called it in and then went after the driver." "That was incredibly dangerous, sir. You could have been killed." "So could she if I'd waited for you guys to show up." The officer frowned at the implied criticism, but didn't argue. Around them, the bridge had been transformed into a circus of flashing lights and emergency vehicles. A tow truck was already positioning itself to pull the Mercedes out of the river, though Daniel doubted there would be much left to salvage. "Mr. Carter?" One of the paramedics approached him with a blanket and a concerned expression. "We'd like you to come to the hospital, get checked out. You've been in cold water for an extended period, and we want to make sure you don't have hypothermia." Daniel was about to refuse. Hospitals were expensive, and he couldn't afford a night away from work, when Elena appeared at his elbow. "Please," she said quietly, "let them check you out. Consider it a personal favor." There was something in her tone, a subtle authority, that made it clear she was used to having her requests honored. Daniel found himself nodding before he'd really made a conscious decision. "All right, but I need to call someone first, let them know I'll be late." He pulled out his waterlogged phone, which was completely dead, and felt a moment of panic. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly neighbor who watched his girls when he had to work late, would be worried sick if he didn't show up by morning. "Here." Elena handed him her own phone, which had somehow survived the crash in a waterproof case. "Use mine." Mrs. Rodriguez answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Hello. Mrs. Rodriguez, it's Daniel. I'm so sorry to wake you up." "Daniel, mijo, where are you? It's almost 1 in the morning." "There was an accident. I'm fine, but I need to go to the hospital to get checked out." Can you stay with the girls until morning?" Of course, of course. But what kind of accident? Are you hurt?" Daniel glanced at Elena, who was being loaded into an ambulance despite her protests that she felt fine. "It's a long story. I'll explain everything when I get home. Kiss Emma and Sophie for me, okay?" "I will. You be careful, mijo. Those girls need their papa." After he hung up, Daniel stood in the rain for a moment, suddenly feeling the full weight of what had just happened. He had risked everything. His life, his daughter's future, for a stranger. It had been instinct, pure and simple, but now that the adrenaline was wearing off, he was beginning to understand just how close he had come to making Emma and Sophie orphans. "Mr. Carter," the paramedic was waiting by the second ambulance. "Ready to go." Daniel took one last look at the broken bridge barrier, at the churning river below, at the place where two lives had intersected in the most dramatic way possible. Then he climbed into the ambulance and let them take him away from the scene of what would turn out to be the most important night of his life. At Mercy General Hospital, Daniel endured 2 hours of tests and observations while doctors made sure he hadn't suffered any lasting effects from his impromptu swim. His core body temperature was low, but not dangerously so, and aside from some cuts and bruises from the debris in the river, he was pronounced fit to go home. Elena was in the room next door, and through the thin walls he could hear her on the phone with someone, her voice crisp and authoritative despite the late hour. "I don't care what time it is in Tokyo, James. Wake him up. No, I'm fine, but my car is at the bottom of a river, and I need transportation. A helicopter. In this weather, are you insane? Fine, send a car. Something with 4-wheel drive." A knock on Daniel's door interrupted his eavesdropping. Elena entered looking remarkably composed for someone who had nearly drowned 3 hours earlier. She had changed out of her ruined suit into green hospital scrubs, and her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, but she still carried herself with that unmistakable air of authority. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I went swimming in a washing machine," Daniel admitted. "You, better than I have any right to." She sat down in the visitor's chair, studying his face with those intense dark eyes. "The doctor says you saved my life twice tonight." "Twice, once by pulling me out of the car and once by getting me to shore. He said if you'd left me in the water even a few more minutes, I would have gone into shock and drowned anyway." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what anyone would do." "We've already established that's not true." Elena leaned forward. "I want to do something for you, to show my gratitude." "That's not necessary. It is to me." Her tone brooked no argument. "I'm Elena Chen, by the way. We were properly introduced in the water, but I don't think either of us was thinking clearly at the time." The name meant nothing to Daniel, but something in the way she said it suggested it should. "Okay. Elena Chen. Nice to meet you properly this time. I'm the CEO of Chen Industries. We're a medical technology company based in San Francisco, but we have operations all over the world. Tonight, when my car went off that bridge, I was on my way back from a meeting with some potential investors in the next town over." Daniel nodded politely, though he had no idea why she was telling him this. Rich lady, fancy car, important meetings. It was a world as foreign to him as Mars. "What I'm trying to say," Elena continued, "is that I'm in a position to help you, to really help you. Whatever you need, money, a job, education for your daughters, I can make it happen." The offer hung in the air between them like a live wire. Daniel felt his pulse quicken, then forced himself to slow down and think. This was how fairy tales started, wasn't it? Poor man saves rich woman transforms poor man's life. But Daniel had learned the hard way that nothing in life was free, and offers that seemed too good to be true usually were. "That's very generous," he said carefully, "but I don't need charity." Elena's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "It's not charity. It's payment for a debt. You risked your life for mine. In some cultures, that creates a bond between people, an obligation that can't be discharged with a simple thank you. This isn't some culture. This is Pleasant Valley, Indiana, where we help people because it's the right thing to do, not because we expect payment." "And that," Elena said quietly, "is exactly why I want to help you." Before Daniel could respond, a knock on the door interrupted them. A young man in an expensive suit entered carrying a briefcase and looking harried, despite the early hour. "Miss Chen, thank God you're all right. I came as soon as I got your message. The car is waiting outside." "Thank you, Marcus." Elena stood up suddenly, all business. "Mr. Carter, this is my assistant, Marcus Wong. Marcus, this is Daniel Carter, the man who saved my life tonight." Marcus turned to Daniel with obvious surprise, taking in his hospital scrubs and working man's hands. "Mr. Carter, Ms. Chen told me what you did. That was extraordinary." Daniel shrugged. It was what needed doing. Elena picked up her purse. Somehow it had survived the crash along with her phone, and pulled out a business card. "Mr. Carter, I'm going back to San Francisco tomorrow, but I'll be in touch. Please think about what I said." She handed him the card, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. The card was elegant, embossed, the kind of thing Daniel had never owned in his life. "And Mr. Carter, thank you for everything." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of hospital soap and the lingering impression of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. Daniel looked down at the business card in his hand. Elena Chen, Chief Executive Officer, Chen Industries. Below her name was a San Francisco address and a phone number with more digits than seemed necessary. He slipped the card into his wallet and tried to put the whole encounter out of his mind. Rich people made grand gestures all the time, he told himself. In a week or two, Elena Chen would be back to her important meetings and billion-dollar deals, and tonight would be nothing more than an interesting story to tell at cocktail parties. The taxi ride home took 20 minutes and cost him $40 he couldn't afford, but Daniel was too exhausted to care. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a cool, clear dawn that made the previous night feel like a dream. As they pulled up to his small rental house on Maple Street, Daniel could see Mrs. Rodriguez's silhouette in the kitchen window, probably making coffee and worrying about him. The house was tiny. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that barely fit a table for 3. The rent was cheap because the neighborhood was rough, and the house needed work Daniel couldn't afford to have done. But it was home, and it was theirs, and as he walked up the cracked sidewalk to the front door, Daniel felt a familiar surge of fierce protectiveness for the life he had built here. Mrs. Rodriguez met him at the door, her round face creased with concern. "Mijo, you look terrible. What happened?" "Car accident on the bridge," Daniel said, which was technically true. "Someone went into the river. I helped pull them out." "Dios mío." Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't, and neither was she." "She..." Daniel realized he had revealed more than he intended. "The driver. She's fine. Everyone's fine." Mrs. Rodriguez studied his face with the penetrating gaze of a woman who had raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. "There's more to this story. There always is. But right now I just want to see my girls." Emma and Sophie were asleep in the room they shared, curled up together in Emma's twin bed like puppies. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching their steady breathing, feeling his heart constrict with love and terror in equal measure. What if he hadn't made it out of the river? What if Mrs. Rodriguez had to wake them up this morning and tell them their father was never coming home? Emma stirred as if sensing his presence, opening sleepy brown eyes that were exactly like her mother's. "Daddy." "Hey, baby girl, sorry I'm late." "You smell like the river," Sophie mumbled without opening her eyes. "I had to help someone who fell in the water." Emma sat up, instantly alert. "Did you save them?" "Yeah, sweetheart. I saved them." "Like a superhero." Daniel smiled and sat down on the edge of the bed. "Not like a superhero, just like a daddy who knows how to swim." But even as he said it, Daniel could feel Elena Chen's business card in his wallet, a small rectangle of possibility that seemed to burn against his hip. Maybe, just maybe, this time the fairy tale was real. Outside, the sun was rising over Pleasant Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a beautiful day. 3 days passed before Daniel heard from Elena Chen. Again, 3 days during which he almost convinced himself the entire encounter had been some kind of fever dream brought on by too much cold river water and hospital antiseptic. He went back to work at the construction site, enduring the good-natured ribbing from his crew about his midnight swim, and tried to fall back into the familiar rhythm of early mornings, hard labor, and grocery store dinners. But the business card remained in his wallet, and sometimes when he was operating the excavator or mixing concrete, he would catch himself thinking about Elena's intense dark eyes and the way she had spoken about obligation and debt. Rich people didn't really follow through on dramatic promises made in hospital rooms, did they? That was the stuff of movies and romance novels, not real life in Pleasant Valley, Indiana. Daniel was proven wrong on Thursday morning at exactly 7:42 a.m. as he was pouring cereal into bowls for Emma and Sophie before school. The knock on his front door was firm, authoritative, the kind of knock that suggested the person on the other side was accustomed to having doors opened quickly. "Daddy, someone's here," Sophie announced unnecessarily, her mouth full of generic cornflakes. "I can hear that, sweetheart." Daniel wiped his hands on a dish towel and went to answer the door, expecting to find Mrs. Rodriguez, or maybe the landlord, with another complaint about the broken garbage disposal. Instead, he found himself face to face with Marcus Wong, Elena's assistant, looking impeccable in another expensive suit despite the early hour. Behind him, parked on the cracked asphalt of Maple Street, like visitors from another planet, were 2 black SUVs with tinted windows. "Mr. Carter," Marcus said with a polite smile. "Good morning. I hope we're not calling too early." Daniel glanced past Marcus at the SUVs, his construction worker instincts automatically cataloging escape routes and potential threats. "Who's we?" "Ms. Chen would very much like to speak with you if you have a moment. She's waiting in the car." Daniel's mind raced. Elena was here. In Pleasant Valley on his street. My daughters are about to leave for school. I need to get them ready and, of course, well, we can wait." The rear door of the first SUV opened and Elena stepped out onto the sidewalk. She looked different in daylight, less like the half-drowned businesswoman he had pulled from the river, and more like what she actually was, a woman of immense power and influence. Her navy blue suit probably cost more than Daniel made in 3 months. Her heels clicked authoritatively on the pavement, and her long black hair was swept back in an elegant chignon that made her look like she belonged on the cover of Fortune magazine. But her eyes were the same, intelligent, determined, and focused entirely on him. "Daniel," she said, and somehow the way she spoke his name made it sound more important than it had ever sounded before. "Thank you for seeing me." "I haven't exactly seen you yet," Daniel replied, acutely aware of his own appearance. Paint-stained work clothes, steel-toed boots, hands that would never look clean no matter how much he scrubbed them. "What are you doing here?" "Fulfilling a promise." Before Daniel could respond, Emma appeared at his elbow, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her math homework clutched in her free hand. She looked up at Elena with the frank curiosity that only 7-year-olds possessed. "Are you the lady my daddy saved from the river?" Elena's expression softened immediately, the corporate mask slipping, to reveal something warmer underneath. "I am." "You must be Emma." Emma's eyes widened. "How did you know my name?" "Your father told me about you, about how smart you are, and how you help take care of your little sister." "Sophie's not that little," Emma said loyally. "She can tie her own shoes and everything." As if summoned by her name, Sophie bounced into view, her backpack hanging off one shoulder and her shoes on the wrong feet. She stopped short when she saw Elena, then whispered loudly to Daniel, "Daddy, why is there a princess on our street?" Elena laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her entire face. "I like your daughters, Daniel. They have good instincts." "Princess," Sophie repeated, delighted by Elena's laugh. "Are you really a princess?" "Not exactly," Elena said, crouching down to Sophie's level with fluid grace despite her high heels. "But I do live in a very tall building, and I have people who help me make important decisions, so I suppose there are some similarities." "Do you have a crown?" "Sophie," Daniel warned, but Elena held up a hand. "I don't have a crown, but I do have something even better." She reached into her purse and pulled out what looked like a small tablet computer. "This can show me pictures of anywhere in the world, and I can talk to people on the other side of the planet with it." Both girls crowded closer, fascinated. Daniel found himself stepping back, watching Elena interact with his daughters, and feeling a strange mixture of pride and unease. Emma and Sophie were good kids, but they weren't used to attention from strangers, especially strangers who looked like they had stepped out of a magazine. "Girls," he said gently, "you need to get going or you'll be late for school." "But Daddy." "No buts. School first, questions later." Emma sighed dramatically, but kissed his cheek before heading toward the street. Sophie followed, but turned back after a few steps. "Princess Elena," she called, "will you be here when I get home?" Elena glanced at Daniel, a question in her eyes. "That depends on your father." After the girls had disappeared around the corner toward the bus stop, Daniel found himself alone with Elena and Marcus on his tiny front porch. The contrast between his modest rental house and the luxury SUVs parked outside was almost comical, like someone had accidentally mixed up the sets for 2 different movies. "You didn't have to come all this way," Daniel said. "A phone call would have been fine. Some conversations are better had in person." Elena's tone was businesslike again, but not unkind. "May we come in? What I have to discuss with you might take a while." Daniel hesitated. His house was clean but shabby, furnished with second-hand furniture, and held together with determination and duct tape. It wasn't the kind of place where women like Elena Chen usually found themselves. "It's not much," he warned. "I didn't come here to judge your decorating choices, Daniel. I came here to talk." The living room felt even smaller with Elena and Marcus in it. Daniel gestured toward the couch, a hand-me-down from Mrs. Rodriguez's son that sagged in the middle but was comfortable enough, and watched as Elena settled herself with the same grace she would probably display in a boardroom. Marcus remained standing, briefcase in hand, looking like a Secret Service agent guarding the president. Daniel had the uncomfortable feeling that this was all some kind of elaborate setup, though for what purpose he couldn't imagine. "Would you like some coffee?" Daniel offered. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." "That would be lovely." Daniel escaped to the kitchen, grateful for a moment to collect his thoughts. Through the thin walls, he could hear Elena and Marcus speaking in low voices, their conversation too quiet to make out, but clearly business-related. He took his time preparing the coffee, using the good mugs instead of the chipped ones he usually used, and trying to figure out what Elena could possibly want from him. When he returned to the living room, Marcus was opening his briefcase and Elena was examining a framed photo of Emma and Sophie that sat on the side table. The picture had been taken last summer at the county fair. Both girls grinning at the camera, cotton candy staining their faces, Daniel's arms wrapped around them both. "They look happy," Elena observed. "They are happy." Daniel set the coffee mugs on the table and sat down across from her. Most of the time, anyway. But it's not easy, raising two children alone. It wasn't a question, and Daniel didn't bother to deny it. Nothing worthwhile is easy. Elena smiled at that, the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her since she'd arrived. "You sound like my grandmother. She used to say that success without struggle was just luck, and luck always runs out eventually." Smart woman. She was. She came to this country from Taiwan with nothing but the clothes on her back and a recipe for soup dumplings. By the time she died, she owned 3 restaurants and had put 4 children through college. Daniel sipped his coffee and waited. Elena was leading up to something, he could tell, but she was taking her time getting there. He had the sense that she was a woman who never did anything without a plan, who calculated every move like a chess player thinking 10 steps ahead. "Daniel," she said finally, "what do you know about Chen Industries?" "Nothing, really. You said you make medical technology." "We do much more than that." Elena set down her coffee mug and leaned forward slightly. "We're one of the largest private medical research companies in the world. We develop new treatments for cancer, heart disease, diabetes. We build hospitals in underserved communities. We provide medical equipment to disaster zones." "That's impressive." "It's also expensive. Very expensive. The kind of work we do requires enormous amounts of capital. Brilliant researchers and partnerships with institutions around the world." Elena paused, studying his face. "But most importantly, it requires leadership. People who understand that business isn't just about profit margins and stock prices." Daniel was beginning to see where this was heading, and he didn't like it. "Ms. Chen..." "Elena, please." "Elena, I appreciate whatever this is you're trying to do, but I'm not the person you think I am. I'm a construction worker. I operate heavy machinery and pour concrete. I don't know anything about medical research or running companies." "You're right," Elena said calmly. "You don't know anything about those things. But you know something much more valuable. Which is, you know how to make decisions under pressure. You know how to assess risk and act quickly when lives are at stake. You understand the difference between what's profitable and what's right." Elena's voice grew more intense as she spoke. "3 nights ago, you jumped off a bridge to save a stranger. You risked everything, your life, your daughter's future, for someone you had never met. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone would have..." "No, they wouldn't have. I've done research since that night, Daniel. I've looked into similar situations and the statistics are sobering. Less than 5% of people would have done what you did. Most would have called for help and waited." "So what are you saying? That because I can swim, I should be running a medical company?" Elena laughed, but it wasn't a mocking sound. "I'm saying that because you have the kind of moral compass that doesn't bend under pressure. You're exactly the type of person I need working with me." Marcus cleared his throat gently and handed Elena a folder from his briefcase. She opened it and spread several documents across the coffee table. "I'm offering you a job, Daniel. Director of Community Outreach for Chen Industries. Your job would be to identify communities that need medical facilities, to work with local leaders, to determine what kind of help would be most beneficial, and to oversee the construction and implementation of new clinics and hospitals. Daniel stared at the papers spread before him. Even upside down, he could see salary figures that made his head spin, benefit packages that included full medical coverage and college funds for Emma and Sophie relocation assistance to San Francisco. "This is insane," he said quietly. "Is it? You have construction experience, so you understand how buildings are put together. You're a single father, so you know firsthand how important accessible healthcare is for families. You've lived in communities like Pleasant Valley your whole life, so you understand what these places need and what they don't need. I don't have a college degree. I don't have any business experience. You'll get the education you need. Chen Industries has partnerships with several universities. You can take classes while you work, or take a sabbatical to complete a degree program, whatever you prefer." Daniel picked up one of the documents, his eyes scanning the job description. Community outreach, project management, liaison with local governments and healthcare providers. It all sounded impossibly sophisticated, far beyond anything he had ever imagined for himself. "Why me?" he asked. "You could hire someone with an MBA, someone who already knows how to do this job." "I could," Elena agreed. "I've hired plenty of people with MBAs, and some of them have been excellent. But here's what I've learned in 10 years of running this company. Technical skills can be taught. Vision can be developed. But integrity, the kind of character that makes a man jump off a bridge to save a stranger, that can't be trained or purchased. You either have it or you don't." Daniel set the document back on the table and rubbed his temples. This was too much, too fast. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been whether he could afford to fix the washing machine before it broke down completely. Now he was being offered a chance to completely transform his life, to give Emma and Sophie opportunities he had never dreamed possible. "I need to think about this," he said. "Of course, take all the time you need." Elena began gathering the documents back into the folder. "But I hope you'll consider something. Your daughters are watching you, Daniel. They're learning from your example about what's possible in life, about how far determination and hard work can take someone. What kind of lesson do you want to teach them?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. Emma and Sophie were watching him, had been watching him every day since their mother left. They had seen him work 2 jobs to keep them fed and housed, had seen him fall asleep at the kitchen table over bills he couldn't quite afford to pay. They had learned from his example that life was about survival, about making do with less, about keeping your head down and your expectations low. But what if there was another way? What if he could show them that sometimes when opportunity knocked, you had the courage to answer, "There's something else." Elena said, her voice softer now. "A more immediate concern. I've been thinking about what you told me that night, about how you were coming home from grocery shopping when you saw my accident." Daniel nodded warily. "It was midnight on a Tuesday, Daniel. You were buying groceries at midnight because that's when they mark down the prices on items that are about to expire." The observation stung because it was true, and because it revealed just how carefully Elena had been analyzing his situation. Daniel felt his defenses rising. "There's nothing wrong with being careful with money. You're absolutely right. But there's a difference between being careful and being desperate." Elena's tone was gentle but direct. "I've done some research into your situation, Daniel. I know about the medical bills from when Sophie had pneumonia last winter. I know your ex-wife doesn't pay child support. I know you're working 60-hour weeks just to stay afloat. You investigated me." Daniel's voice was sharper than he intended. "I protected myself," Elena corrected. When someone saves your life, you want to know who they are. But what I found wasn't a background check. It was a man who's been quietly heroic every day for 3 years, not just for one dramatic moment on a bridge. Daniel stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out on Maple Street. Outside, Mrs. Rodriguez was hanging laundry on her line, and the mailman was making his rounds. Normal life, ordinary problems, familiar struggles, the life he knew how to navigate. "This is all happening too fast," he said. "4 days ago, I didn't even know you existed." "I understand, but sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of making decisions on our own timeline." Elena rose and joined him at the window. "Can I tell you something about myself, Daniel? Something I don't usually share in job interviews." He turned to look at her, surprised by the personal turn in the conversation. 5 years ago, I almost died in a climbing accident in Nepal. I was attempting to summit a peak that had never been climbed by a woman, and I fell into a crevasse. For 16 hours, I lay at the bottom of that ice cave, both legs broken, certain I was going to die alone on a mountain nobody had ever heard of. Elena's voice was matter-of-fact, but Daniel could hear the echo of old terror underneath. "A Sherpa named Pemba found me. He had no reason to risk his life for a foolish American woman who had bitten off more than she could chew. He could have marked my location and gone for help, waited for a proper rescue team. Instead, he rappelled down into that crevasse and carried me out on his back." "Did you offer him a job too?" Daniel asked, then immediately regretted the sarcasm. But Elena smiled. "Actually, yes. Pemba is now the head of our disaster relief operations in Southeast Asia. He's saved more lives in the past 5 years than I can count." She turned away from the window to face him directly. "The point is, Daniel, that when someone saves your life, it changes you. It makes you see the world differently. Pemba didn't just pull me out of a hole in the ice. He showed me what courage really looks like, what selflessness really means. And I knew I wanted that kind of person working alongside me." Daniel felt some of his resistance crumbling. There was something in Elena's voice, a sincerity that cut through all the corporate polish and expensive suits. She wasn't offering him charity or trying to assuage some rich person's guilt. She genuinely believed he had something valuable to contribute. "What would happen to my girls?" he asked. "If I took this job, if we moved to San Francisco, they would have access to some of the best schools in the country. Emma could study advanced mathematics, science, whatever interests her. Sophie could take dance classes, art classes, music lessons. They would grow up in a city full of museums and theaters and opportunities you can't even imagine yet." It was a seductive vision, and Daniel felt himself wanting to believe it was possible. But wanting something and being able to achieve it were two very different things. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "I don't know if I'm smart enough or sophisticated enough to work in your world." "Intelligence and sophistication aren't the same thing," Elena said firmly. "You solved a life-or-death problem in under 30 seconds on that bridge. You assessed the situation, calculated the risks, and executed a plan that saved 2 lives. That's the kind of thinking I need." Marcus cleared his throat again, glancing at his watch. "Ms. Chen, we do have the conference call with the Tokyo office in an hour." Elena nodded, but didn't move away from the window. "Daniel, I'm not asking you to decide right now. Take the weekend. Think it over. Talk to your daughters if you want. But consider this, On. What's the worst that could happen if you try? If it doesn't work out, you can always come back to Pleasant Valley. Your life here will still awaiting. And what's the best that could happen?" Elena's smile was radiant. "You could help save thousands of lives. You could show Emma and Sophie that their father is capable of extraordinary things. You could discover that the man who jumped off a bridge to save a stranger is capable of much more than he ever imagined. After Elena and Marcus left, Daniel found himself sitting alone in his living room staring at the business card he had pulled from his wallet. The house felt different somehow, as if Elena's presence had changed the very air inside it. Through the walls he could hear Mrs. Rodriguez's television and the distant sound of construction from the new subdivision going up across town. This was his world, small, familiar, manageable. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every neighbor's story, every shortcut to every place that mattered. Emma and Sophie were happy here, rooted in a community that had watched them grow up. Was it fair to uproot them for his own ambitions? But then he thought about the job Elena had described, about the clinics and hospitals that could be built, the communities that could be helped. He thought about Emma asking why some people had so much while others had so little, and Sophie's questions about why the doctor cost so much money when she had strep throat. Maybe this wasn't about his ambitions at all. Maybe it was about using the skills he had developed, problem-solving, quick thinking, the ability to work with his hands and his heart, in service of something larger than himself. The sound of the school bus rumbling down Maple Street interrupted his thoughts. Emma and Sophie would be home soon, full of questions about the princess who had visited their house and stories about their day at school. Tonight he would make them dinner and help them with their homework and read them bedtime stories, just like always. But tomorrow, maybe he would start imagining a different kind of future, one that began with a leap of faith off a bridge and led to places he couldn't even picture yet. The business card felt warm in his hand, like a promise waiting to be kept. The conversation with Emma and Sophie that evening proved to be more complicated than Daniel had anticipated. He waited until after dinner, after homework was finished and the dishes were cleared, before sitting them down on the sagging couch where Elena had made her extraordinary offer just hours earlier. "Girls, I need to talk to you about something important." He began, his hands fidgeting with the business card he still carried in his pocket. "About the lady who came to visit today." "Princess Elena!" Sophie exclaimed, bouncing on the cushions. "Is she coming back? Can we show her my drawings?" "Maybe, sweetheart. But first, Daddy needs to tell you something. She offered me a job, a new job in a different city." Emma's expression immediately grew serious. At 7 years old, she had already learned to read between the lines of adult conversations, to listen for the things that weren't being said out loud. "Would we have to move? We might. To California. It's very far away." "How far?" Sophie asked. "About as far as you can go and still be in America." The room fell quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of Mrs. Rodriguez's television through the thin walls. Daniel watched his daughters process this information, saw Emma's protective instincts kick in as she automatically moved closer to Sophie. "Would we ever come back?" Emma asked carefully. "I don't know, baby. Maybe to visit." "What about Mrs. Rodriguez? And my teacher, Ms. Patterson? And the library?" Daniel felt his heart constrict. These were exactly the questions he had been dreading, the ones that made him wonder if he was being selfish even to consider Elena's offer. Emma and Sophie had already lost their mother. Was it fair to ask them to give up everything else familiar too? "There would be new teachers in California," he said gently. "New libraries, new friends." "But I like my friends here," Sophie said, her lower lip beginning to tremble. "I like Tommy from down the street, and I like playing in our backyard." "I know you do, sweetheart. This is a big decision, and Daddy hasn't made up his mind yet. I wanted to talk to you first to see how you felt about it." Emma had been quiet, thinking with the intensity that sometimes made her seem much older than her 7 years. Finally, she looked up at Daniel with those serious brown eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. Is it because we don't have enough money? She asked. The question caught Daniel off guard. He had tried so hard to shield his daughters from his financial struggles to make their small life feel secure and abundant, despite the constant worry about bills and groceries and unexpected expenses. What makes you ask that, Em? I heard you on the phone with the man about the car payment. And sometimes you don't eat dinner, so there's more for me and Sophie. Daniel's throat tightened. He thought he had been so careful, so discreet about the sacrifices he made to keep them fed and housed. But children noticed everything filed away, every worried expression and every skipped meal. It's not just about money, he said, though that wasn't entirely true. The lady I helped, Elena, she thinks I could do important work. Help people who need hospitals and doctors. Like when Sophie was sick with pneumonia, Emma asked. Yes, like that. Sophie perked up at the mention of her illness from the previous winter, when her fever had spiked so high that Daniel had spent 3 terrifying days in the hospital with her watching machines monitor her breathing and praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Will there be doctors in California? Sophie asked. Lots of doctors. Some of the best doctors in the world. What if I get pneumonia again? Then you'll get the best care possible, Daniel promised. Emma was still thinking, her small face scrunched up in concentration. Daddy, do you want to take this job? It was a simple question, but it cut right to the heart of everything Daniel had been wrestling with since Elena walked out of his house that morning. Did he want it? The honest answer was more complicated than yes or no. He wanted the security it would provide for his daughters. He wanted the chance to give them opportunities he had never dreamed possible. He wanted to stop lying awake at 3 in the morning, calculating and recalculating whether he could afford to fix the washing machine, or buy new winter coats, or pay for Sophie's asthma inhaler. But he also wanted it for himself, and that scared him. He wanted to find out if Elena was right, if the man who had jumped off a bridge possessed skills and qualities that could be useful in a larger context. He wanted to discover whether Daniel Carter was capable of more than survival. I think I do, he said honestly, but not if it would make you girls unhappy. We could try it, Emma said slowly. And if we don't like it, we could come back, right? Right. Sophie climbed into Daniel's lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Will Princess Elena be our friend in California? I think she'd like that very much. That night, after the girls were asleep, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with Elena's business card and his cell phone, staring at the number he was supposed to call. It was nearly 10 o'clock, probably too late to make such an important phone call, but he found himself dialing anyway. Elena answered on the second ring, as if she had been waiting by the phone. Daniel, is everything all right? I'm sorry to call so late. I know you're probably busy. Never too busy for you. Have you made a decision? Daniel took a deep breath. I want to say yes, but I need to know more about the practical details. Where we would live, what kind of schools the girls would attend, that sort of thing. Of course. Why don't you come to San Francisco next weekend, you and the girls? I can show you around, let you see what the city has to offer. No pressure, just information. I can't afford plane tickets to California. That's what corporate credit cards are for. Marcus will handle all the arrangements. Daniel hesitated. Accepting the trip felt like crossing a line, like admitting he was seriously considering upending his entire life for a woman he barely knew. Daniel, Elena's voice was gentle. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. You've already proven you're good at that. All right, we'll come. Excellent. I'll have Marcus call you tomorrow with the details. And Daniel, thank you for trusting me with this. After he hung up, Daniel sat in his quiet kitchen for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around him. In 12 hours, his carefully ordered world had been turned completely upside down. Tomorrow, he would have to call his supervisor and ask for time off. He would have to tell Mrs. Rodriguez they were going away for the weekend. He would have to start imagining a future that looked nothing like the present. But for now, he just sat in the darkness and tried to believe that sometimes fairy tales came true. The flight to San Francisco was the first time Emma and Sophie had ever been on an airplane, and their excitement was infectious. Daniel found himself relaxing as he watched them press their faces to the small window, marveling at the clouds below and the toy-like cities spread out beneath them. "Look, Daddy." Sophie breathed her nose, leaving smudges on the glass. "Everything looks so little." "That's because we're very high up," Emma explained with the authority of someone who had recently learned about altitude in school. "We're probably flying through the atmosphere." Daniel smiled and settled back in his seat, which was far more comfortable than anything he had expected. Elena had arranged for first-class tickets, despite his protests that Coach would be fine. Everything about this trip felt surreal, from the leather seats to the flight attendant, who offered them warm towels and fancy snacks. Marcus met them at the airport in yet another black SUV, greeting the girls with the kind of patient charm that suggested he had experience dealing with children. As they drove through the city, Daniel found himself staring out the window at a landscape that might as well have been on another planet. San Francisco was nothing like Pleasant Valley. The hills rose and fell like frozen waves lined with houses that clung to impossible angles. The bay stretched out blue and endless, dotted with sailboats and cargo ships. Everything was bigger, brighter, more intense than anything Daniel had ever experienced. "Where are all the farms?" Sophie asked, pressing her face to the window. "There aren't many farms in the city," Marcus explained. "But there are parks and beaches and museums, lots of things to explore." They were staying at a hotel near the waterfront, in a suite that was larger than Daniel's entire house back in Pleasant Valley. The girls ran from room to room, exclaiming over the marble bathroom and the view of the bay, while Daniel stood in the living area feeling completely out of place. "This is too much," he said when Marcus handed him the key cards. "We don't need all this space." "Ms. Chen wanted you to be comfortable. She'll pick you up for dinner at 7 if that works for you." After Marcus left, Daniel helped the girls unpack their small suitcases and tried to process everything that was happening. This morning, they had been in Indiana. Tonight, they would be having dinner with one of the most powerful businesswomen in the country. It felt like some kind of elaborate dream. Elena arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, dressed more casually than Daniel had yet seen her. Instead of a business suit, she wore dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. But she still carried herself with that unmistakable air of authority that seemed to bend the world around her to her will. "How was your flight?" she asked, crouching down to greet Emma and Sophie at their eye level. "We were above the clouds," Sophie announced, "and they gave us peanuts in a real bowl." "That sounds very exciting. Are you hungry? I thought we could go somewhere special for dinner." The restaurant Elena chose was unlike anywhere Daniel had ever eaten. It overlooked the bay with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a panoramic view of the water and the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. The maitre d' greeted Elena by name and led them to a table that had clearly been reserved in advance. "This is really nice," Emma said politely, her eyes wide as she took in the elegant surroundings. "I'm glad you like it. I thought you might enjoy watching the boats in the bay while we eat." As if on cue, a large sailboat glided past the windows, its white sails catching the last rays of sunlight. Sophie clapped her hands in delight, and even Emma forgot to be sophisticated for a moment. Over dinner, fish for the adults, chicken nuggets for the girls, because Elena had somehow known to ask for a children's menu. They talked about San Francisco, about the differences between city life and small-town life, about the opportunities that might await them here. "There's an excellent elementary school just a few blocks from where you'd be living," Elena told Emma. "They have a science program that includes marine biology field trips to the bay." "What's marine biology?" Sophie asked. "It's the study of fish and whales and all the creatures that live in the ocean," Elena explained. "Scientists here have discovered new species of fish that nobody knew existed before." Daniel watched his daughter's faces light up with interest and felt a familiar tug of possibility. Back in Pleasant Valley, the most exotic wildlife they encountered were the raccoons that got into the garbage cans. Here, apparently, children could study creatures from the depths of the Pacific Ocean. "What about dance classes?" Sophie asked hopefully. "Could I learn to be a ballerina?" "There are several excellent dance studios in the city. Ballet, jazz, modern dance, whatever interests you." "And what about you, Emma? What would you like to learn?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I like math and reading. Are there good libraries here?" "Some of the best in the world. The main library downtown has more books than you could read in 10 lifetimes. And there are museums where you can learn about everything from dinosaurs to space exploration." As the evening progressed, Daniel found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't expected. Elena was wonderful with his daughters, patient with their questions, and genuinely interested in their thoughts and opinions. She didn't talk down to them or try to impress them with adult sophistication. Instead, she seemed to understand that they were intelligent people who happened to be small. "Elena," Emma said as dessert arrived, "why did you want my daddy to work for you?" It was a direct question, the kind only children asked, and Daniel felt himself tense slightly. But Elena didn't seem fazed. "Because your father is a very special person," she said seriously. "He has the kind of courage that most people only read about in books. When he saw that I was in trouble, he didn't hesitate to help, even though it was dangerous for him." "Daddy's always helping people," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "He helped Mrs. Martinez when her husband got sick, and he fixed Mr. Johnson's fence when the storm knocked it down." "That doesn't surprise me at all. People who are truly brave aren't brave just once. They're brave every day in small ways and big ways." Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Elena, it's true," she said, looking directly at him. "And that's exactly the kind of person I need working with me. Someone who understands that helping people isn't just a job, it's a way of life." Later, as Elena walked them back to their hotel, Daniel found himself walking slightly behind with her, while the girls ran ahead chattering excitedly about everything they had seen. "They're remarkable children," Elena said. "You should be very proud." "I am. They're the best thing I've ever done. I can see that, and I can see how much they love you. They feel safe with you, secure. That's not something you can fake." Daniel glanced at her, wondering if there was a story behind that observation. "Did you feel safe when you were their age?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "My parents were very focused on success, achievement. They wanted me to be the best at everything. The best student, the best violinist, the best daughter. Safety wasn't really part of the equation." "Is that why you started your own company, to prove something to them?" "Maybe. Or maybe to prove something to myself." Elena smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "It's taken me a long time to understand the difference." They had reached the hotel, and Emma and Sophie were already in the lobby admiring the enormous flower arrangement that dominated the central atrium. Daniel paused before going inside, looking back at the city spread out behind them. "This is all so different from what I know," he said. Sometimes I wonder if I'm crazy to even consider it. The best decisions usually feel a little crazy at first. If they didn't, everyone would make them. What if I fail? What if I'm not smart enough or capable enough to do the job you're offering me? Elena turned to face him, her expression serious. Daniel, 3 days ago you saved my life. Tomorrow I want to show you something that might change your perspective on what you're capable of. The next morning, Elena picked them up in a different car, a more modest sedan that didn't attract quite so much attention. They drove south from the city, through rolling hills covered in vineyards and oak trees, until they reached a small town that reminded Daniel a little of Pleasant Valley, though the landscape was completely different. This is Oakvale, Elena explained as they parked in front of a modern building that looked like it had been built recently. Population about 8,000, mostly agricultural workers and their families. The building turned out to be a medical clinic, gleaming and new, with a sign that read, Chen Industries Community Health Center. Elena led them through the front doors, into a bright, welcoming space filled with families waiting to see doctors. This is what Chen Industries does, Elena said, gesturing around the clinic. 6 months ago, this building didn't exist. The nearest hospital was 40 miles away, and most of the families here couldn't afford to take time off work to make that trip. A middle-aged Latina woman in scrubs approached them, her face lighting up when she saw Elena. Ms. Chen, what a wonderful surprise. Are you here for the pediatric wing dedication? Actually, Dr. Morales, I wanted to show some friends around. Daniel, this is Dr. Carmen Morales, the clinic director. Carmen, this is Daniel Carter and his daughters Emma and Sophie. Dr. Morales shook Daniel's hand warmly. Any friend of Ms. Chen's is welcome here. Would you like a tour? As they walked through the clinic, Dr. Morales explained how the facility served the community. They had a full-time staff of doctors and nurses, a pharmacy that provided medications at cost, and a mobile unit that visited the surrounding farms to provide care for workers who couldn't leave their chums. Before this clinic opened, we were losing people to preventable diseases, Dr. Morales said. Diabetes that went untreated, heart conditions that were never diagnosed, children who suffered from asthma because their families couldn't afford inhalers. They stopped in front of a wall covered with thank you cards and drawings from children, dozens of them in Spanish and English, all expressing gratitude for the care they had received. This is what your father would be helping to build, Elena said quietly to Emma and Sophie. Clinics like this one all over the country, in places where people need them most. Emma studied the wall of cards intently. So Daddy would be like a doctor? Not exactly, Elena explained. But he would help make sure that doctors and nurses have places to work and that families like yours have places to go when they need medical care. Sophie tugged on Daniel's shirt. Daddy, could you build a place like this in Pleasant Valley? The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. Pleasant Valley didn't have a clinic like this one. The nearest hospital was 20 minutes away, and Daniel knew firsthand how expensive medical care could be. When Sophie had pneumonia, he had nearly bankrupted himself paying for her treatment. Maybe, sweetheart. Maybe someday. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Dr. Morales pulled Elena aside for a private conversation. Daniel couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the passion in the doctor's gestures, the gratitude in her expression. Dr. Morales seems to really appreciate what you've done here, Daniel observed as they walked back to the car. This clinic has saved lives, Elena said simply. When I was lying at the bottom of that crevasse in Nepal, all I could think about was how many projects would go unfinished if I died. How many clinics wouldn't get built? How many communities wouldn't get the help they needed? That's when I realized that what we do at Chen Industries isn't just business. It's literally a matter of life and death. On the drive back to San Francisco, The girls fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the day's adventures. Daniel found himself thinking about the clinic, about the families he had seen receiving care, about the wall of thank you cards from grateful children. "How many clinics like that have you built?" he asked. 43 in the United States, another 67 internationally. We're planning to open 15 more this year. And you want me to help with that? I want you to lead it. The community outreach program has been successful, but it needs someone who understands what these communities actually need, someone who's lived in places like Oakvale and Pleasant Valley. Daniel was quiet for a while, watching the landscape roll past outside the window. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "That night on the bridge when I jumped into the river, I didn't think about it. I just acted. I know. This feels different. Bigger. More complicated. It is bigger, and it is more complicated. But Daniel, the fundamental choice is the same. Do you help, or do you walk away?" That evening, Elena took them to dinner at a smaller, more casual restaurant in a neighborhood that felt more residential, less touristy. The girls were tired but happy, full of stories about everything they had seen and done. "I liked the fish clinic," Sophie announced over her pasta. "It smelled like hospitals, but in a good way." "Medical clinic," Emma corrected. "And I liked all the pictures the kids drew. They were really good." Elena smiled. "I'm glad you enjoyed it. Tomorrow I thought we could visit some schools if you'd like, just to see what they're like here." Both girls perked up at this suggestion, and Daniel found himself nodding along. He was beginning to understand that Elena's approach to persuasion was subtle but effective. She wasn't trying to convince him with arguments or pressure, but simply showing him what was possible. "Elena," he said, as they walked back to the hotel after dinner, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you have children?" Elena was quiet for a moment, and Daniel wondered if he had overstepped some boundary. But when she answered, her voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "No. I always assumed I would someday, when the company was more established and I had more time. But someday has a way of never arriving." "Do you regret that?" "Sometimes. Especially when I meet children like Emma and Sophie. They remind me that there are important things in life beyond quarterly reports and board meetings." Daniel glanced at his daughters, who were walking ahead of them, still chattering about their day. "They're what keep me grounded. When everything else in life gets complicated, they're what makes sense." "That's a gift, Daniel. Not everyone is lucky enough to have that kind of clarity about what really matters." That night, after the girls were asleep in their hotel beds, Daniel stood at the window looking out at the San Francisco Bay. The city lights reflected on the water like scattered diamonds, and in the distance he could see the outline of the Golden Gate Bridge, iconic and majestic against the dark sky. His phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Rodriguez. "How is California, mijo? The girls having fun?" Daniel typed back. "They love it here. Lots to see and do." "And you? Are you thinking about staying?" Daniel stared at the question for a long time before responding. "I think I might be." 3 dots appeared immediately, indicating that Mrs. Rodriguez was typing a response. "Follow your heart, Daniel. Those girls need to see their papa reach for his dreams." Daniel smiled and put the phone away. Mrs. Rodriguez had known him since he was Emma's age, had watched him grow up on Maple Street, marry his high school sweetheart, struggle through his divorce. If anyone understood the magnitude of the decision he was facing, it was her. Tomorrow, they would visit schools and explore more of the city. Tomorrow, he would have to start making concrete decisions about the future. But tonight, he stood at the window of a luxury hotel and allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to build a life in this place, to give his daughters opportunities he had never dreamed possible, to be part of something larger than himself. Outside, the city hummed with possibility, and for the first time since Elena Chen had walked into his life, Daniel began to believe that fairy tales might be real after all. The decision to accept Elena's offer came not with fanfare or dramatic revelation, but quietly over breakfast in their hotel room, while watching Emma help Sophie cut her pancakes into perfect squares. Daniel realized that he had already made his choice somewhere between the medical clinic in Oakvale and the moment Sophie had asked if he could build a place like that in Pleasant Valley. "I want to say yes," he told Elena when she called that morning to check on their plans for the day. "But I need time to tie up loose ends back home. Give my supervisor proper notice, find someone to take over my apartment lease, that sort of thing." "Of course. Take all the time you need. When do you think you could start?" Daniel looked around the hotel room that had become their temporary home at his daughters, who were already talking about which schools they wanted to visit and whether they could learn to surf. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Perfect. Marcus will handle all the relocation details, and Daniel, welcome to Chen Industries. The flight back to Pleasant Valley felt different from the journey out. Emma and Sophie pressed their faces to the windows again, but this time they were looking down at their future rather than their past. They chattered excitedly about the schools they had visited, the marine biology programs, the dance studios Elena had shown them. "Daddy," Emma said, as the plane began its descent into Indianapolis. "Are you scared?" "A little," Daniel admitted. "Are you?" "A little, but also excited. Is that okay?" "That's perfectly okay, sweetheart. Sometimes the best adventures start with being a little scared." Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting in her front yard when their taxi pulled up to Maple Street, and the sight of her familiar figure made Daniel's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. This woman had been more than a neighbor. She had been a grandmother to his girls, a confidant during his darkest moments, a constant source of support and wisdom. "Mijo," she said, wrapping him in a fierce hug that smelled like vanilla and fabric softener. "You look different." "Do I? Taller, maybe. Or maybe just more hopeful." That evening, after the girls were in bed, and Mrs. Rodriguez had been thoroughly briefed on every detail of their California adventure, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and began making lists. Things to do before the move, people to call, arrangements to make. The list grew longer as he thought about everything that would need to happen over the next 6 weeks. Canceling utilities, forwarding mail, saying goodbye to the life he had built here. But with each item he wrote down, he felt a growing sense of excitement rather than loss. The hardest conversation came the next morning when he sat down with his supervisor at the construction site to explain that he would be leaving. "California." Bob Henley removed his hard hat and scratched his graying head. "Jesus, Danny, that's one hell of a career change." "I know it sounds crazy. Sounds like an opportunity. Those don't come along very often for guys like us." Bob extended his weathered hand. "You're a good worker, Danny. Best I've had in 20 years. But you're also smart enough to know when it's time to move on." Daniel shook the offered hand, surprised by how emotional the simple gesture made him feel. "Thanks, Bob, for everything. Keep in touch, will you? Let us know how it goes out there in the land of fruits and nuts." Word of Daniel's impending departure spread quickly through Pleasant Valley's close-knit community. Over the following days, he found himself having similar conversations with teachers, neighbors, the pharmacist who had helped him when Sophie was sick, the mechanic who had kept his Honda running on prayer and determination. Each goodbye was harder than he had expected, not because he was having second thoughts, but because he was finally understanding how deep his roots in this place really were. Pleasant Valley might not have offered much in terms of opportunity or excitement, but it had given him something precious, a community that cared about him and his daughters. "You're doing the right thing," Ms. Patterson, Emma's teacher, assured him during their final parent conference. "Emma is gifted, Daniel. She needs challenges that we simply can't provide here. But don't let her forget where she came from." "I won't," Daniel promised. "Pleasant Valley will always be home." As the weeks passed and the move drew closer, Daniel found himself living in two worlds simultaneously. During the day, he went through the motions of his old life, work errands, the familiar routines that had sustained him for years. But in the evenings, he talked to Elena on the phone about his new position, received packages from Marcus containing contracts and relocation information, and helped Emma and Sophie research their new schools online. "Daddy, look," Sophie announced one evening, showing him a website on Elena's tablet, which had somehow made its way into their possession. "My new school has a playground with a castle on it. And mine has a library with 3 floors, Emma added. 3 whole floors of books." Daniel smiled at their enthusiasm, but he also noticed the way they still said "my new school" rather than "my school," as if they were still trying on the idea for size. The transition was harder for them, Sima, than they let on he knew. Emma especially was old enough to understand what they were leaving behind. One evening, about 3 weeks before their scheduled departure, Daniel was packing boxes in his bedroom when he heard a soft knock on his door. Emma peeked her head and her expression unusually serious. "Daddy, can I talk to you?" "Of course, baby. Come here." Emma climbed onto the bed and settled beside him, picking at the comforter with nervous fingers. "Are you sure we're doing the right thing? Why do you ask?" "I heard Cassie's mom talking to Mrs. Johnson at the grocery store. She said you were getting too big for your britches and that California would chew you up and spit you out." Daniel felt a flash of anger at whoever had been gossiping about his family where his daughter could overhear, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "What do you think about that?" "I think Cassie's mom doesn't know you very well. You saved a lady from drowning Daddy. If you can do that, you can do anything." Daniel pulled Emma close, marveling once again at the wisdom that seemed to come so naturally to his 7-year-old daughter. "You know what, I think you're right. But I'm still a little scared." "Me too. Want to know a secret?" Emma nodded. "I think Elena is a little scared too. Starting this new program, trusting someone like me to help her with something so important. But sometimes the best things happen when everybody's a little scared together." "Will you still be my daddy in California?" The question was so earnest, so vulnerable that Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Emma, sweetheart, I will be your daddy no matter where we are in the world. Nothing will ever change that. Even if you become important and wear fancy suits." Daniel laughed. "Even if I become the most important person in California and wear the fanciest suits in the world, I will still be your daddy, and you and Sophie will still be the most important people in my life." Emma seemed satisfied with this answer, snuggling closer to him as he continued packing. "Daddy, yeah, I think Mommy would be proud of you." The comment caught Daniel completely off guard. Emma rarely mentioned her mother, and when she did, it was usually in the context of something practical, whose eyes Sophie had inherited, or whether their mother had liked chocolate ice cream. This was the first time she had ever offered an opinion about what her mother might think of Daniel's choices. "What makes you say that?" "She always said you were the bravest person she knew. That's why it didn't make sense when she left. But maybe she was scared too. Maybe she wasn't brave enough to stay and see how brave you really are." Daniel held his daughter closer, amazed by her insight, and heartbroken by the mature way she was trying to make sense of her mother's abandonment. "Maybe you're right. I'm glad she left," Emma said quietly. "Emma, I am, because if she hadn't, we wouldn't be a team. And if we weren't a team, maybe you wouldn't have been driving home that night, and maybe you wouldn't have saved Elena, and maybe we wouldn't be going to California." Daniel stared down at his daughter, awed by the way her 7-year-old mind had connected these dots, turned abandonment into destiny. "You think it all happened for a reason. I think maybe sometimes bad things happen so good things can happen later. Like fertilizer. Fertilizer. Mrs. Rodriguez told me that her garden grows better when she puts smelly old food scraps in the dirt. The old food is gross, but it makes the new flowers grow." Daniel smiled, thinking that Elena would appreciate Emma's agricultural metaphor for resilience. "You're pretty smart, you know that. I get it from my daddy." 2 weeks before the move, Daniel received an unexpected phone call from Elena. Instead of their usual evening conversation about logistics and timelines, she called in the middle of the afternoon, her voice tight with stress. "Daniel, I need your help." "What's wrong?" "There's been a situation at one of our clinic sites. The one we visited in Oakvale. There's been flooding from the storm systems that came through Northern California, and the clinic is right in the middle of it." Daniel could hear the tension in Elena's voice, the kind of controlled panic that came from caring deeply about something that was in immediate danger. "How bad is it?" "Bad. The entire first floor is underwater, and we have patients who need dialysis, pregnant women who are due any day, elderly people on oxygen who can't be moved easily. The county evacuation center is overwhelmed, and the nearest hospital is 40 miles away. What do you need me to do? I know this is asking a lot, and I know you're not officially starting work for another 2 weeks, but—" "Elena," Daniel interrupted. "What do you need me to do?" There was a brief pause, and when Elena spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I need you to help me save these people." 6 hours later, Daniel was on another plane to California, this time traveling alone. Emma and Sophie were staying with Mrs. Rodriguez, who had taken the news of his emergency departure with characteristic calm. "Go," she had said, pressing a thermos of coffee into his hands. "Do what you do best. Help people." Elena met him at the San Francisco airport herself, driving a rugged SUV instead of the luxury sedans he was used to seeing her in. She looked different, too. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore jeans boots and a Chen Industries sweatshirt. "Thank you for coming," she said, as they navigated through traffic toward the highway. "I know this isn't how you planned to start. Tell me about the situation." As they drove north through the darkness, Elena filled him in on the details. The clinic in Oakvale sat in a low-lying area that had flooded twice in the past decade, but never this severely. The storm system had stalled over the region, dumping unprecedented amounts of rain in a short period. The creek that ran behind the clinic had overflowed its banks, turning the surrounding area into a lake. "Dr. Morales and her staff have been working around the clock to keep the clinic operational," Elena explained. "They moved all the critical equipment to the second floor, but they're essentially trapped. They can't evacuate the patients who need ongoing care, and new people keep arriving looking for help." "What about emergency services?" "Overwhelmed. The county has 3 other towns dealing with similar flooding, and their resources are stretched thin. We're essentially on our own." They reached Oakvale just after midnight, and the scene that greeted them was like something from a disaster movie. The normally quiet main street was covered in 2 feet of muddy water, and the clinic building sat like an island in the middle of a temporary lake. Emergency vehicles lined the higher ground around the flooded area, their red and blue lights painting surreal patterns on the water's surface. Daniel and Elena met with the incident commander, a tired-looking man named Captain Rodriguez, who briefed them on the situation. "We've got about 60 people in that clinic," he said, pointing toward the building. "Maybe half of them are patients who need medical care. The other half are families who had nowhere else to go. The good news is the building is structurally sound. The bad news is we can't get our heavy equipment close enough to stage a proper evacuation." "What about boats?" Daniel asked. "We've got 2, but they're small. It would take all night to get everyone out one at a time, and some of these people can't be moved that way. We need a better solution." Daniel studied the scene, his construction worker's brain automatically assessing the logistics. The clinic sat about 200 yards from the nearest dry ground, surrounded by water that looked to be 3 to 4 feet deep. Too deep to walk through safely, but not deep enough for large boats. "What about a temporary bridge?" he suggested. Captain Rodriguez looked skeptical. "With what materials and how would we anchor it?" Daniel was already walking toward the fire trucks looking for equipment that might be useful. "You've got extension ladders, right? And rope." "Yeah, and those concrete barriers from the road construction project down the street." "I suppose, but I don't see how." "Elena," Daniel called, "do you have Dr. Morales' number? I need to talk to her about the layout inside the clinic." For the next hour, Daniel worked with Captain Rodriguez and the emergency crews to design and build a makeshift bridge system. Using extension ladders lashed together and anchored to concrete barriers, they created an elevated walkway that stretched from the clinic's second-floor window to dry ground. It wasn't pretty, and it wouldn't win any engineering awards, but it was functional. More importantly, it would allow them to evacuate patients safely and efficiently. "You think this will hold?" Captain Rodriguez asked as they tested the bridge's stability. "It'll hold," Daniel said, with more confidence than he felt. "But we need to move fast. This water level could change quickly if they get more rain upstream." Elena had been coordinating with Dr. Morales throughout the bridge construction, and as soon as it was ready, she climbed across to the clinic to help organize the evacuation from the inside. Daniel remained on the dry side, helping people as they made their way across the improvised bridge. The first to come across were the patients who could walk unassisted. Elderly residents of a nearby nursing home who had been brought to the clinic when their facility lost power. They moved slowly but steadily, helped by volunteers who had appeared from somewhere in the crowd of emergency workers. Next came the families with children, parents carrying babies, and holding the hands of toddlers who thought the whole adventure was an exciting game. Daniel found himself thinking of Emma and Sophie, wondering what they would make of this surreal nighttime rescue operation. The more challenging evacuations came last. Patients on dialysis who needed to be moved on stretchers. A woman in labor who was having contractions every few minutes. An elderly man on oxygen whose tank was running low. "Easy does it," Daniel called out, as paramedics carefully maneuvered the dialysis patient across the bridge. "Take your time. The bridge isn't going anywhere." But even as he said it, Daniel could see that the water level was rising. What had been 3 feet deep when they started was now closer to 4 feet, and the current was getting stronger. Elena appeared at the clinic window, her face tight with concentration. "That's everyone except Dr. Morales and 2 nurses," she called across the gap. "They're doing a final check to make sure we didn't miss anyone." "Tell them to hurry," Daniel replied. "This water is still rising." As if to emphasize his point, a piece of debris, what looked like part of a fence, came floating past the clinic, moving faster than it had been an hour earlier. The storm was far from over. Dr. Morales was the last person to cross the bridge, and by the time she reached dry ground, the water had risen high enough that the lower anchor points were completely submerged. The bridge held, but barely. That was cutting it close, Captain Rodriguez observed, as they watched the improvised structure disappear beneath the rising water. Close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. Daniel replied a phrase he had learned from his construction crew. Everyone's safe. That's what matters. As dawn broke over the flooded valley, Daniel found himself sitting on the tailgate of an ambulance sharing coffee and energy bars with Elena while they watched the sun paint the water in shades of gold and pink. The clinic building was now completely surrounded by floodwater, but it was empty of people and secure. The patients, Daniel asked. All stable. The woman in labor delivered a healthy baby boy about an hour ago. She wants to name him Daniel. Daniel nearly choked on his coffee. She wants to what? Daniel Flood Martinez. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Elena, I just helped build a bridge. I didn't deliver a baby. You created a path to safety when there wasn't one before. That's what leaders do, Daniel. They find solutions when everyone else sees only problems. Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking about the night's events. 12 hours ago, he had been packing boxes in his bedroom in Pleasant Valley. Now he was sitting in a disaster zone, having helped evacuate 60 people from a flood. It felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. Is this what the job is going to be like? He asked. Sometimes. Not always this dramatic, but... Elena shrugged. When you're in the business of helping people, there are always going to be emergencies. Situations where someone needs to step up and make things happen. And you think I can do that? Elena turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes serious. Daniel, I've seen you jump off a bridge to save a stranger, and I've watched you improvise a rescue operation for 60 people with nothing but fire department equipment and determination. At this point, I'm pretty sure you can do anything. As the day wore on and the immediate crisis passed, Daniel found himself working alongside Elena and the emergency crews to assess the damage and plan for recovery. The clinic's first floor was a total loss, but the building itself was structurally sound. With the right equipment and enough time, it could be restored. How long before it's operational again? Daniel asked Dr. Morales as they toured the water-damaged facility. 6 months, maybe 8, and that's if everything goes perfectly. What happens to your patients in the meantime? Dr. Morales' expression was grim. They go without care, or they drive 40 miles to the county hospital and wait 6 hours to be seen, same as before we built this place. That evening, as Daniel and Elena drove back toward San Francisco, they passed the temporary shelter that had been set up for flood victims. Families sat on cots in a high school gymnasium, their possessions reduced to whatever they had been able to carry to safety. Stop the car, Daniel said suddenly. What? Stop the car. I want to talk to these people. Elena pulled into the school parking lot, and they walked into the gymnasium together. The scene was heartbreaking but familiar. Daniel had seen similar situations when tornadoes had hit towns near Pleasant Valley. People who had lost everything but were grateful to be alive. He spent the next hour moving through the shelter, talking to families, listening to their stories, understanding what they needed most. An elderly woman whose medications had been left behind in the evacuation. A man whose construction tools, his livelihood, were sitting in 4 feet of muddy water. Children who were trying to be brave but were clearly traumatized by the upheaval. What are you thinking? Elena asked as they walked back to the car. I'm thinking these people need more than just a place to sleep. They need hope. They need to know that someone cares about rebuilding their community. What did you have in mind? Daniel was quiet for a moment, an idea forming in his mind. What if we didn't just rebuild the clinic? What if we made it better, bigger? What if we turned this disaster into an opportunity? Elena smiled, and Daniel could see the excitement building in her expression. Keep talking. a full-service medical center. Not just primary care, but specialist services, preventive care, health education. And while we're building it, we bring in mobile units to serve the community. Make sure nobody goes without care. That would be expensive, very expensive, but it would save lives. And it would show these people that someone believes their community is worth investing in. Elena stopped walking and turned to face him. Daniel, are you officially accepting the position? Because what you're describing sounds exactly like the kind of project I hired you to lead. Daniel looked back at the school gymnasium, thinking about the families inside who had lost so much, but were still hoping for a better tomorrow. He thought about Emma and Sophie asleep in Mrs. Rodriguez's house back in Pleasant Valley, trusting him to build a future worthy of their courage. Yes, he said, I'm accepting, but I have one condition. Name it. I want to start here, in Oakvale. I want this to be my first project. Elena extended her hand with a smile that transformed her entire face. Welcome to Chen Industries Director Carter. As they shook hands in the parking lot of a flood-damaged town with the stars beginning to appear in the clearing sky above them, Daniel felt something shift inside him. For the first time since he had jumped off that bridge 2 months ago, he truly understood what Elena had seen in him. He wasn't just a construction worker who had gotten lucky. He was a man who ran toward trouble instead of away from it, who saw solutions where others saw only problems, who understood that helping people wasn't just a job. It was a calling. The fairy tale was real, but it wasn't about being rescued by a princess. It was about discovering that he had been a hero all along. 18 months later, Daniel stood on the observation deck of the new Oakvale Medical Center, watching as the last pieces of construction equipment were loaded onto flatbed trucks. The building behind him rose 4 stories into the California sky, its glass facade reflecting the golden afternoon light that had become as familiar to him as the gray winters of Indiana once were. Daddy, look! Sophie's voice carried across the deck as she pointed toward the hospital's helipad, where a medical helicopter was practicing landing procedures. It's like a giant dragonfly. Emma, now 9 and every bit as observant as she had been at 7, corrected her sister with good-natured precision. It's a Eurocopter EC-135. They use them for emergency medical transport because they're fast and can land in small spaces. Daniel smiled at the exchange, marveling at how much his daughters had grown and changed since their arrival in California. Emma had thrown herself into her new school's advanced science program with characteristic intensity, while Sophie had discovered a love for both ballet and marine biology that seemed to surprise no one except herself. The pilot said we can tour the helicopter later, Elena said, joining them at the railing. She wore a simple blue dress and comfortable flats, instead of her usual business attire, having learned over the past year and a half that construction sites and high heels were incompatible. Really? Sophie bounced on her toes with excitement. Can we see all the medical stuff inside? We can see everything, Elena promised. After the dedication ceremony. The dedication ceremony. Daniel felt his stomach tighten with familiar nerves as he thought about the crowd gathering in the plaza below. Local officials, medical professionals, Chen Industries, board members, and hundreds of community members who had waited 2 years for this moment. In 30 minutes, he would be expected to give a speech about the medical center, about the community partnership that had made it possible, about the future of healthcare in rural California. You're nervous, Elena observed, reading his expression with the accuracy that had developed between them over months of working together. Terrified, Daniel admitted. Speaking to construction crews is one thing. This is different. It's the same thing, just more people. You're telling them about something you built, something you're proud of. We built, Daniel corrected. I couldn't have done any of this without your support." Elena smiled, but there was something in her expression that Daniel couldn't quite read. Over the past 18 months, their working relationship had evolved into something deeper and more complex. They had spent countless hours together planning projects, traveling to potential clinic sites, working late into the night on funding proposals and construction timelines. Somewhere along the way, Daniel had stopped seeing Elena as his boss and started seeing her as his partner, not just in business, but in the larger mission of bringing healthcare to underserved communities. She was brilliant, driven, and passionate about the work they were doing together. She was also kind to his daughters, patient with his learning curve, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that emerged only when she was comfortable. "Daniel," Emma said, tugging on his sleeve, "look who's here." Daniel followed his daughter's gaze to the plaza below, where a familiar figure was making her way through the crowd. Mrs. Rodriguez, wearing her best church dress and a hat that Daniel remembered from Easter services back in Pleasant Valley, was being escorted by Marcus toward the VIP seating area. "You flew her out here?" Daniel asked Elena, his voice thick with emotion. "She practically raised you according to what you've told me. I thought she should see what you've accomplished." Daniel felt tears prick at his eyes. In the whirlwind of the past year and a half, he had kept in touch with Mrs. Rodriguez through phone calls and video chats, but seeing her here in this place that represented everything his life had become was overwhelming. "And look who else is here," Emma added, pointing to another section of the crowd. Daniel's former construction crew from Pleasant Valley stood together near the main entrance, looking slightly uncomfortable in their dress clothes, but grinning broadly. Bob Henley, his old supervisor, caught Daniel's eye and gave him a thumbs up. "How many people did you invite to this thing?" Daniel asked Elena. "Everyone who mattered to you. Everyone who helped shape the man who built this place." Before Daniel could respond, Marcus appeared on the observation deck with his usual impeccable timing. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Carter, it's time." The walk to the podium felt like the longest journey of Daniel's life. The plaza was packed with hundreds of people, all looking up at him expectantly. Television cameras from local news stations tracked his movement, and photographers captured every step. Daniel had given dozens of presentations over the past year, mostly to small groups of medical professionals or community leaders. But this was different. This was public, ceremonial, historic. The Oakvale Medical Center represented more than just a building. It was proof that communities like this one mattered, that their needs were worth the investment of resources and energy. Elena introduced him with words that still sounded surreal to his ears. Director of Community Outreach for Chen Industries, visionary leader in rural healthcare development, the man whose innovative approach to community partnership has revolutionized how we think about medical facility development. When Daniel stepped to the podium, the crowd fell silent. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some strange, all waiting to hear what he had to say about this place they had all helped create. 2 years ago, Daniel began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. This community faced a crisis. Your medical clinic was underwater, your patients had nowhere to go for care, and your families were scattered across emergency shelters with no idea when they might come home. He paused, looking toward the spot where the old clinic had stood, now transformed into a beautifully landscaped healing garden. Today, you have something better than what you lost. You have a medical center that serves not just Oakvale but 12 surrounding communities. You have specialists who travel here from San Francisco and Los Angeles. You have a trauma center that has already saved 17 lives since it opened 6 months ago. The crowd began to applaud, but Daniel raised his hand for quiet. He had more to say. But this building, impressive as it is, isn't really what we're celebrating today. We're celebrating something much more important. We're celebrating what happens when a community decides to believe in itself. Daniel's eyes found Elena in the crowd, and he drew strength from her encouraging nod. When Chen Industries first approached this community about rebuilding after the flood, we could have simply reconstructed what was here before. But the people of Oakvale asked for something more. They asked for a facility that would serve not just their immediate needs, but the needs of their children and grandchildren. They asked for a place that would make their community stronger, healthier, more resilient. The applause was stronger this time, and Daniel could see people in the crowd nodding in agreement. Dr. Morales, who now served as the medical center's chief of staff, was beaming with pride. This medical center exists because of partnerships, Daniel continued, between Chen Industries and the Oakvale community, between local contractors and specialty firms from the Bay Area, between established medical professionals and newly graduated residents who chose to start their careers in a rural setting because they believed in our mission. Daniel paused again, thinking about the speech he had practiced and the words that were coming from his heart instead. But mostly, this medical center exists because people decided to help each other. In ways big and small, dramatic and everyday, the people in this community have shown what's possible when we refuse to accept that some places matter less than others. As Daniel spoke, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The midnight drive across Pleasant Valley Bridge that had changed everything. The decision to jump into dark water for a stranger. The phone call that had transformed his life and his daughter's lives in ways he was still discovering. 2 years ago, I was a construction worker in Indiana who had never imagined I would find myself standing here today. But I learned something important during that flood, and I've learned it again every day since. We're all capable of more than we think we are. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us what we're made of. Sometimes it takes someone else believing in us before we can believe in ourselves. Daniel's voice grew stronger as he neared the end of his speech. The Oakvale Medical Center is more than a building. It's proof that when we work together, when we refuse to accept that problems are too big or resources too limited, we can create something extraordinary. He gestured toward the medical center behind him, its windows catching the late afternoon sun. This is what hope looks like when it's built from concrete and steel, staffed with compassionate professionals and supported by a community that refuses to give up on itself. The applause that followed was thunderous, lasting several minutes, and punctuated by cheers and whistles from the crowd. Daniel stepped back from the podium, his heart racing, and his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. Elena joined him on the stage for the official ribbon cutting, along with Dr. Morales, the mayor of Oakvale, and several other dignitaries. But as Daniel held the oversized scissors and posed for photographs, he found his attention drawn to his daughters, who were standing in the front row next to Mrs. Rodriguez. Emma was clapping enthusiastically, her face glowing with pride. Sophie was jumping up and down, still too young to fully understand the significance of the moment, but caught up in the excitement nonetheless. And Mrs. Rodriguez was crying happy tears, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while never taking her gaze off Daniel. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse and tour groups formed to explore the new facility, Daniel found himself surrounded by well-wishers and reporters. But the conversation he had been most looking forward to was with Mrs. Rodriguez, who made her way through the crowd with the determined persistence of a woman on a mission. "Mijo," she said, pulling him into another of her fierce hugs. "I am so proud of you, I could burst." "Mrs. Rodriguez, I can't believe you're here. Thank you for coming. Like I would miss this, you think I'm going to let you become famous without me seeing it with my own eyes?" Daniel laughed, feeling some of the tension from the day begin to drain away. "Famous is a strong word. Don't you be modest with me, Daniel Carter. I saw those news trucks. I heard that speech. You've done something important here. We've done something important. I couldn't have gotten here without everything you taught me. Mrs. Rodriguez's expression grew serious. What I taught you was to take care of your family and help your neighbors. Everything else, this vision, this leadership that came from inside you, I just helped you stay grounded while you figured it out. Before Daniel could respond, Emma and Sophie appeared at his elbows, both talking at once about everything they had seen during their tour of the medical center. "Daddy, they have a robot that delivers medicine to patients," Sophie announced breathlessly. "And the emergency room has a direct video link to specialists in San Francisco," Emma added. "If someone comes in with a rare condition, the doctors here can consult with experts in real time." "And the pediatric wing has murals painted by local artists," Sophie continued. "And the children's library has books in 3 languages. Daniel smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm, remembering how overwhelmed he had felt during his first visit to San Francisco 18 months ago. Now Emma and Sophie moved through environments like this medical center with confidence and curiosity, asking sophisticated questions and understanding complex systems in ways that still amazed him. "What was your favorite part?" Daniel asked. "The helicopter," Sophie said immediately. "The research lab," Emma replied. "Dr. Martinez is studying new treatments for childhood asthma, and she said I could come back and visit when she's running experiments." As the afternoon turned to evening, the official events wound down and were replaced by more intimate conversations. Daniel found himself standing in the healing garden, behind the medical center, talking with Dr. Morales about plans for the next phase of expansion. "The pediatric specialist clinic should be operational by next spring," she was saying, "and we're already seeing interest from other communities about replicating this model." "That's the goal," Daniel replied, "to prove that this kind of comprehensive care is sustainable in rural settings, then help other places build their own versions." "You know, when Elena first told me about this community outreach position, I was skeptical. I thought it was just corporate public relations. But what you've built here, it's not just a medical center. It's a statement about what these communities deserve." Daniel was about to respond when he noticed Elena approaching across the garden, having changed from her dedication ceremony dress into jeans and a Chen Industries sweatshirt. She had been moving through the crowd all evening, thanking donors and speaking with board members, but this was the first time they had been alone together since the morning. "How are you feeling?" she asked as Dr. Morales excused herself to check on last-minute details inside the building. "Exhausted, exhilarated, grateful." Daniel sat down on one of the garden benches, looking up at the medical center that had consumed so much of his energy over the past year and a half. "Sometimes, I still can't believe this is real." Elena joined him on the bench, following his gaze to the building. "It's real. And it's just the beginning." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the Oakvale model is already being requested by 6 other communities. Politicians in Sacramento are talking about legislation to incentivize rural medical development. The American Medical Association wants you to speak at their annual conference." Daniel felt a familiar mix of excitement and anxiety at the prospect of expanding their work. That's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot of opportunity. To help more communities, to save more lives, to prove that innovative partnerships can solve problems that government and traditional healthcare systems have struggled with for decades. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the evening settling around them. Somewhere in the distance, a mariachi band was playing at the community celebration that had sprung up organically in the plaza. The music mixed with the gentle hum of the medical center's air handling systems and the occasional sound of a helicopter practicing approaches. "Elena," Daniel said finally, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." Are you happy, really happy with how all this has turned out? Elena was quiet for so long that Daniel wondered if he had overstepped some boundary. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. I've spent most of my adult life focused on metrics, revenue growth, market share, stock performance. All important things, but they don't. She paused, searching for the right words. Watching that helicopter land today, knowing that it's going to save lives in communities that never had access to emergency medical transport before. That's a different kind of success than I'm used to. Is it better? Elena turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting the lights from the medical center. It's better because I get to share it with people who understand what it really means. With communities that have invested their hopes in what we're building. She trailed off, and Daniel could see her struggling with something. With me, he prompted gently. With you, she confirmed. Daniel, these past 18 months have been the most professionally satisfying of my career. But they've also been the most personally fulfilling. Working with you, watching Emma and Sophie grow up being part of something that matters in such an immediate, tangible way, it's changed how I think about everything. Daniel felt his heart rate quicken. The conversation had taken a turn he had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. Elena, I know this is complicated, she continued quickly. You work for me technically. There are professional considerations, and you have your daughters to think about, and I don't want to make things awkward if I'm misreading the situation. Daniel stood up from the bench and moved to face her directly. You're not misreading anything. I'm not. I've been trying to figure out how to have this conversation for months. Every time we work late in the office, every time you help Emma with her science projects, every time Sophie insists that you're the only one who can braid her hair properly, I've been wondering if what I was feeling was real, or if I was just grateful, or if it was just the adrenaline from all the changes in my life. Elena smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Daniel had seen from her all day. And what conclusion did you reach? That it's real. That what I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude or adrenaline, and everything to do with the fact that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. Remarkable how? Daniel laughed. Are you seriously going to make me list all the ways you're remarkable? We'll be here all night. I have nowhere else to be. Daniel reached for her hands, struck by how natural the gesture felt. You're brilliant and driven and compassionate. You see solutions where other people see problems. You've built an empire, but you haven't forgotten that business is ultimately about helping people. You make my daughters feel like they can accomplish anything, and you make me believe that maybe I'm worthy of everything that's happened over the past 2 years. Daniel, you saved my life, literally, and then you've spent every day since then helping me save other people's lives. If anyone's remarkable here, it's you. So what do we do about it? Elena's smile grew wider. Well, I suppose we could start by acknowledging that what's happening between us is more than just a professional partnership. Consider it acknowledged. And then we could agree that despite the complications and the professional considerations and the fact that this whole situation is completely unprecedented, in my experience, we're both willing to see where this leads. Are we talking about dating? Because I should warn you, it's been a while since I've done that, and I come with 2 very opinionated children who have strong feelings about bedtimes and breakfast cereal preferences. Elena laughed, a sound that Daniel had come to treasure over the past months. I think I can handle Emma and Sophie's breakfast cereal requirements. The question is whether you can handle dating someone whose idea of a romantic evening is reviewing construction budgets for rural medical facilities. I think that sounds perfect. Daniel leaned closer, and Elena met him halfway, their first kiss taking place in the healing garden behind the medical center, that had brought them together in ways neither of them had anticipated. It was soft and tentative, and full of promise, interrupted only by the sound of applause from the direction of the plaza. They broke apart to find Emma and Sophie standing at the edge of the garden, clapping enthusiastically. "Finally," Emma declared. "Sophie and I were wondering when you two were going to figure that out." "You were wondering about that?" Daniel asked, his face heating with embarrassment. "It was pretty obvious," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Elena looks at you the same way Mrs. Rodriguez looks at her telenovelas." Elena burst into laughter. "I'm not sure how to take that comparison." "It's a good thing," Emma assured her. "Mrs. Rodriguez really loves her telenovelas." As they walked back toward the plaza together, Daniel and Elena hand in hand, Emma and Sophie running ahead to rejoin the community celebration. Daniel found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 2 years ago, he had been a single father struggling to make ends meet in a small Indiana town. Tonight, he was walking through a medical center he had helped design with a woman he loved, and daughters who were thriving in ways he had never dared to imagine. The transformation hadn't been magic, though it had certainly felt magical at times. It had been the result of hard work, calculated risks, and the kind of support system that Daniel was still learning to accept and reciprocate. "Daddy," Sophie said, running back to grab his free hand, "are you and Elena going to get married?" "Sophie," Emma scolded, "you can't just ask people that. Why not?" "It's a reasonable question," and Daniel looked at Elena, who was grinning at his daughter's directness. "What do you think?" he asked her. "Is it a reasonable question?" "I think it's a question for another day," Elena replied diplomatically. "Right now, I'm just happy that your father and I have figured out that we care about each other." "But someday," Sophie persisted. "Someday is a possibility," Elena agreed. As they rejoined the celebration in the plaza, Daniel was struck by the realization that this was what happiness looked like. Not a single dramatic moment, but a collection of small contentments that added up to something larger than their individual parts. The mariachi band was still playing, and couples had begun dancing on the improvised dance floor that had been set up near the medical center's main entrance. Children ran between the tables, chasing each other with the boundless energy that Daniel remembered from his own daughter's younger years. "Daniel, doctor," Morales called from across the plaza. "Come settle an argument. Dr. Patterson from the county hospital insists that trauma centers in rural areas aren't sustainable long-term. I told him he was wrong, but I think he needs to hear it from the man who made this place possible." "Go," Elena said, giving him a gentle push toward the group of medical professionals who were gathered around one of the tables. "I'll keep an eye on the girls." Daniel spent the next hour moving through the celebration, having conversations with community members, medical staff, and visiting dignitaries about the Oakvale model and its potential for replication. It was work in a sense, but it was also deeply satisfying to see how many people had been touched by what they had accomplished here. "Mr. Carter." A young woman with a press badge approached him near the mariachi band. "I'm Sarah Martinez from the Sacramento Bee. Could I ask you a few questions about the community partnership model you've developed here?" "Of course." "This medical center represents a significant investment, nearly $50 million. How do you justify that kind of spending in a community of 8,000 people?" It was a question Daniel had heard variations of many times over the past year from skeptical board members, budget-conscious administrators, and journalists looking for a controversial angle. "The question isn't how we justify the investment," Daniel replied. "The question is how we justify not making it. The people in this community, and communities like it all across the country, deserve access to high-quality health care. They deserve to know that if their child has an asthma attack or their parent has a heart attack, Help is minutes away instead of hours away. But is it economically sustainable? This medical center will serve 12 communities within a 50-mile radius. It will provide jobs for over 200 people, many of whom will spend their salaries locally. It will reduce the burden on overcrowded urban hospitals by keeping patients closer to home. And it will save lives that might otherwise be lost because help was too far away. Daniel paused, thinking about the families he had met in the flood shelter 18 months ago, about the patients who had already been treated in this facility, about the children who would grow up knowing that their community was worth investing in. But beyond the economics, he continued, there's something else to consider. When we build facilities like this, we're sending a message to rural communities that they matter, that their lives and their children's lives are worth protecting, that they don't have to choose between staying in the places they love and having access to modern medical care. The reporter scribbled notes quickly. And you think this model can be replicated elsewhere? I know it can, because I've seen what happens when communities are given the resources and support they need to solve their own problems. This medical center exists because the people of Oakvale didn't just ask for help. They rolled up their sleeves and helped build it. As the evening wound down and families began gathering their children for the journey home, Daniel found himself standing once again on the observation deck, this time with Elena, Emma, and Sophie. The plaza below was being cleaned up by volunteers, the mariachi band was packing their instruments, and the medical center's night shift was beginning their rounds. "It's been a good day," Elena said, leaning against the railing beside him. "The best," Daniel agreed. "Daddy," Emma said, settling into one of the deck chairs with a tired sigh. "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if we're coming back to visit Pleasant Valley for Christmas." "What did you tell her?" "That we'd ask you. Are we?" Daniel looked at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea. Mrs. Rodriguez should meet Elena properly, and you girls should see your old friends. And you should see how much your old neighborhood has changed," Elena added. "I hear they're building a new community center where the old grocery store used to be." "You've been keeping track of Pleasant Valley?" Daniel asked, surprised. "I keep track of places that are important to people I care about." Sophie, who had been unusually quiet for the past few minutes, suddenly perked up. "Elena, when we go to Indiana, will you come with us? If your father wants me to, and if I'm invited." "You're invited," Sophie announced immediately. "And you have to stay in our old house so you can see where Daddy grew up." "Actually," Daniel said, "Mrs. Rodriguez is renting our old house to a new family. But I'm sure she'd be happy to put us up if Elena doesn't mind sleeping on a pull-out couch." "I think I can handle that," Elena replied with a smile. As they prepared to leave the medical center and return to their hotel, Daniel took one last look around the observation deck. In 18 months, this place had become more than just a job site. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people worked together toward a common goal. Tomorrow, he would begin planning the next project. There were communities in Texas and Montana and North Carolina that had already reached out about replicating the Oakvale model. There were conferences to attend, presentations to give, partnerships to develop. But tonight, he was simply a man standing with his family, because that's what Elena had become, he realized, family. Looking out at a community that was stronger and healthier because of the work they had done together. "Ready to go home?" Elena asked, and Daniel noticed that she had used the word home to refer to their shared life in San Francisco, not just his apartment or her house. "Ready," he said, and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with their immediate travel plans. As they made their way down from the observation deck and through the quiet corridors of the medical center, Daniel thought about the conversation he would have with Emma and Sophie on the plane tomorrow, about Elena and what her presence in their lives might mean for their future. He thought about the speech he would give at the American Medical Association conference, about the communities that were waiting for help, about the partnerships that still needed to be built. But mostly, he thought about the moment 2 years ago, when he had seen headlights in his rearview mirror and made the split-second decision to pull over and help. That single choice had led to everything else. The rescue, the job offer, the move to California, the medical center, and now the possibility of a future with Elena that felt both surreal and inevitable. "Elena," he said, as they reached the parking garage, "thank you." "For what?" "For seeing something in me that I didn't know was there. For trusting me with work that matters. For making my daughters feel like they belong in your world." Elena stopped walking and turned to face him. "Daniel, you didn't just save my life that night on the bridge. You showed me what it looks like when someone acts without thinking about personal cost or benefit, when someone simply does what's right because it's right. That's not something you can teach or train or hire. That's something you either have or you don't." She reached up to touch his face gently. "And you have it. You've always had it. I just gave you a place to use it." As they drove through the quiet streets of Oakville toward the highway that would take them back to San Francisco, Daniel looked in the rearview mirror at his daughters, both fast asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the day's excitement. Emma was clutching a small model of the medical center that one of the staff members had given her, while Sophie had somehow managed to fall asleep holding both her seatbelt and Elena's hand. "They love you," Daniel said quietly. "I love them too," Elena replied. "More than I expected to. More than I knew I was capable of. And me." Elena smiled, the same radiant expression that had captivated him from the very first night they met. "I love you too, Daniel Carter. More than I ever thought possible." As they drove through the darkness toward home, Daniel found himself thinking about bridges. Not just the one where their story had begun, but all the bridges they had built since then. Between communities and healthcare providers. Between his old life and his new one. Between a struggling single father and a powerful businesswoman who had somehow found their way to each other. In the distance, the lights of the Bay Area began to appear, marking the approach to the city that had become their sanctuary and their launching pad for everything that was still to come. The fairy tale was real, Daniel thought, but not in the way he had once imagined. It wasn't about being rescued or transformed by external forces. It was about discovering that he had always possessed the courage and the vision to build something extraordinary, and finding someone who believed in that vision enough to help him make it real. 2 years ago, he had jumped off a bridge to save a stranger. Tonight, he was driving home with the woman he loved and the daughters who had learned that their father was capable of miracles. The bridge where it all began still stood over the Clearwater River, carrying travelers safely across the water that had once seemed so threatening. But Daniel no longer needed that bridge to define him. He had learned to build his own bridges now, connecting communities and hearts and futures in ways that would last long after the construction equipment was gone and the dedication ceremonies were forgotten. And in the quiet darkness of the car, with Elena's hand in his and his daughters sleeping peacefully in the back seat, Daniel Carter understood that the best bridges were the ones that brought people together, not just the ones that carried them safely to the other side. The story that had begun with a rescue had become something much larger, a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the willingness to believe that sometimes when you leap into the darkness to help a stranger, you might just find yourself saving more than one life.